In this video, I talk about when coping mechanisms don't work and what we can do as an alternative.
This is how legends are made.
So today I wanted to just share a conversation I've been having through the DMs, which I mentioned before, I think, regarding how people are asking for some help on particular issues, variety of things. And one in particular came to mind was just about a lady who was struggling with depression. And she was having a particular approach and investigating a number of things, and she was discussing a number of coping mechanisms, which really kind of like spurned on the thought, and I've had a conversation with other people about the coping mechanisms. And it's a bit of a challenging subject because obviously anything that benefits someone and they get some long-term change from is wonderful, and that is always to be applauded. Sometimes I find, and this is my approach, my thinking on coping mechanisms, it's kind of like the horse has bolted already and now we're trying to rein it in and calm it down. And that's okay in some circumstances, but it's also very difficult to be a long-term one because we're always living with the issue which we want to resolve. I'm far more interested and far more fascinated in how we actually get behind the horse, as it were, behind that behavior, behind the coping, before the coping has to happen. What can we do before that so it never arrives? So it's not even like before the barn door has even been unlocked. It's what can we do to make sure it never needs to. And so I have a kind of a funny relationship with coping mechanisms because I always feel they've kind of resolved the situation after, like a plaster or a band-aid, but they are temporary sometimes and they don't always work. So what I enjoy the most is doing stuff but that's before all that, before you actually need a coping mechanism. So a coping mechanism is something that happens at a conscious level. You have to begin to do certain things. This could be relaxation, meditation, mindfulness, or some sort of CBT or DBT exercise. And that's all on the other side. But we still leave the part that's behind that, the intention, a part of ourselves that has got a voice in there that's not being heard or needs to escape. And so whilst coping mechanisms are lovely and if they work, that's great, but are we really resolving the longer term challenge or issue behind the scenes? Are we simply just dealing with it once it's out and not understanding what's going on behind? And some of the therapies out there often deal with this, and some therapies that I have more challenges with are the ones which are about simply diverting the behavior to something else. You may cure someone of alcoholism, if you like, if it's a cure, but if you stop them being an alcoholic, they may then become a bigger smoker, or they might bite their nails more, or they might express themselves in different ways which is still very unhealthy for them, because the behavior is the externalization, the thing on the outside of what's really going on the inside. And the best work that I'm ever involved in has always got to do with what's happening on the inside before the horse is bolted. The way I've worded it in the past is like a coping mechanism is, if it works, it's lovely. It's like maybe you're landing a fish. Okay, I'm vegan, so I wouldn't do this, but so it's like landing a fish and you're holding the fish up and it's fine. And that's great, it's all going very well. But what happens if the fish comes alive again? You don't have the mechanism to then cope with it again because you're holding it already. It flips and flops and maybe hits you and then it flies back into the water. We haven't actually caught it or resolved it. And sometimes some therapies and these types of coping strategies can do that too. When we think we've got the fish in our arms and it seems fine, and then it'll do something brand new and fresh that we hadn't thought of, that we don't have a mechanism for, and we're tumbling back down the hill that we came from. I hope these string of metaphors between fishes and hills and horses kind of make some sort of sense. So it encourages you, if anything at all, to do this one thing for me. If you need a coping mechanism, use them. If they're effective, that's great. But let's become a problem detective. Let's get curious to understand actually what are the triggers that led up to that situation. I would suggest one way of doing it, which is to pen and paper, or I know, a device, writing down what happened before the trigger, before the event that caused you needing a coping mechanism, and then what happened before that, and before that, until you get to the point where you notice something that actually was the kind of the key which created the trigger, and really begin to notice it. Now, I'm not asking you to change anything. I'm going to become aware of what the pattern of behavior it is, so that you can then notice it again. That way you'll hopefully not need the coping mechanism at the end of it once the horse is bolted, but by knowing the key, you'll do something different before you get to that kind of trigger point. So take the time to notice, what did it take for you to go into that issue or that challenge? What were the steps? What did you hear? What did you think? What did you see? What was going on for you before it all happens? And at some point, as you go through, you backtrack through there, you're going to notice something which would have been the key which created the biggest amount of feeling and trigger for the event, which would be something more useful, or at least combined with coping mechanisms might help more. It may be something that you easily can adjust, and sometimes it really is. So just giving you another way of looking at this. The coping mechanisms work wonderfully when they do, but often they're not going to be enough, because the intention behind that, the horse that waits on the other side of the barn door, is changing. It'll do something different. I've got a sense that a lot of you will be aware of this, is when you think you're coping with something, it then does something different you weren't prepared for, because the mechanism is set just for that particular situation. You have to then bring another one to then resolve it again, if that makes sense. If it doesn't, drop me a comment and I'll answer it. But I want to give you an impression of what's actually the most useful work that you can do, is noticing what's going on behind the scenes. Once we get there, well, then there's more opportunity to make the change you actually need without ever having to get to that trigger point again. So try that exercise out. See how you find it. Let me know in the comments as always. Have a fantastic day where you are, and I'll catch you next time.
This is how legends are made.